Now we all know about emboss resist, right? But did you know that there's other techniques that you can do that combine ink blending and heat embossing supplies that you probably already have, and great techniques to make quick, easy, and beautiful cards? Let's dive in and get started. All right, my little assistant's gonna give me a hand today going through all of the techniques, and during the techniques, you can always use your own stash. And I'm going to be using my brand new Peacock collection here, so you get a little bit of a preview of what you can do with all of these products. Now, just a quick note about my collections, they are not restocked once they sell out, and I do have a feeling that there are a few in this collection, especially the background stamp we're going to use in a moment, that are going to sell out quickly. So if you do want this collection, be sure to check out the video description below for any links to stores. All right, so getting started in the techniques today, we are going through the ink blending process here. You can also just grab yourself a piece of cardstock, that's fine too. I just like the variation you get in the ink blending. If you're not confident in ink blending, but you still want to add some texture to your card, feel free to grab a piece of colored cardstock and then just ink the edges of them to darken them up in a similar color or a darker color of the shade of cardstock that you're using. For this card tutorial today, I'm using just the same inks on every single one of the cards. Now, you do need to make sure that your panel is dry when you're finished. That's one pro of using colored cardstock instead. But I left this overnight to dry. You could also just zap it with a heat tool and it will be dry in just a minute or two, but just make sure that it's all dry, and you can test it to see if it's dry by pouring a little bit of embossing powder on it and seeing if it sticks before doing any stamping so that you don't ruin your card. I ruined one of my panels doing this by stamping it, covering it with the embossing powder, and the background was still wet, so it just stuck everywhere. I recommend for this technique using a fine embossing powder, because this stamp is so detailed. This is the Shake Your Tail Feathers mandala stamp. So I went in with embossing ink, and I'm gonna go ahead and reach for something that I rarely reach for when it comes to heat embossing, and that is my clear embossing powder. I really don't use it too often. This is a great way to create a subtle background that doesn't distract from the focal point of the card. And also a great way that isn't an emboss resist technique, but a great way to use embossing powder with your ink blending. So I'm gonna go in and heat up this powder, and you can see it does go clear, but it is shiny, and it does create sort of a monochromatic look, and you really get some beautiful details in this here. So you can see what this looks like when it's laying flat, and then you can see what it looks like when you hold it up to the light, that you get that shiny look. And then I'll show you it up close and then in a photograph as well, so you can really get the true look of it, because I find the camera doesn't quite do it justice. So here you go, this is the final card. I topped it off with a piece of gold strip cardstock, and then I heat embossed a sentiment in gold, added some gold pearls, and then I finished off the card. I added this panel to a white card base to help the colors pop, but also to give more attention to that background stamp. Here's a final look at this card here before moving on to the next technique. All right, so the most common technique, as I was saying before, is the emboss resist technique when it comes to ink blending and heat embossing. So I wanted to show a quick example of that using this same stamp, the Shake Your Tail Feather mandala stamp. So I've stamped this using some embossing ink or VersaFine ink onto a piece of white cardstock, and I'm going to cover it with some fine detail white embossing powder. It's important, again, to use fine detail because this is such a detailed stamp. If you use normal embossing powder, it will work as well, but you might not get all the beautiful details of the stamp as it's intended to be used. I'm going to heat up this stamp here using my heat tool, holding it up to the light to make sure that I'm seeing the shine, so I know that the embossing is finished. Next up, I'm going to grab my inks. I'm using Bay Breeze, which is a turquoise color, and I'm going to be using some suede shoes as well. This is a very vibrant blue, and then I'm going to be using a purple color. These were the original colors that I was intending to use on all the cards, but then I couldn't find my ink refills for whatever reason, and they needed to be re-inked, so I switched to my Concord and 9th inks. Equally good, so use whatever inks are in your stash. I use a paper towel as well to clean things up. That way any of the ink that is sitting on top of the embossing powder gets wiped off. You can see that I die cut the word proud, and I used the frame to help line everything up. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add several layers of these letters, one on top of the other, to really make it stand out and pop, because I think right now it's getting a little lost against that white background. You can see that after I've added 2 or 3 layers of these letters, it tends to pop out a little more with the dimension. Here's a final look at the card. As you can see, the emboss resist technique is still probably the most beautiful technique you can do with ink blending and heat embossing, but definitely not the only one. Let's learn more. Let's begin by grabbing a feather stamp and stamping it onto our card. I'm going to be using a bit of a technique here that involves getting different colors of ink onto a stamp. I'm going to be stamping using some blending tools. I find this to be the easiest way to do this technique to avoid harsh lines. You can also use your ink pad and go directly on top of the stamp, but I would still recommend using either a makeup sponge or one of these domed folders or foams, there we go, there's the word, here to soften up the edges that you might get, because the edges of the ink pads will give harsh lines. So I'm going to go in and add the different colors to different areas and stamp it down. If I overlap the areas, it's not a big deal. If I screw up, I can start over. It's really not the end of the world. But the important thing is, once you ink up the whole stamp, is to leave the stamp in the stamping tool, because we're going to go over it a second time. If you happen to not dry your stamp in between while you're cleaning your layers, what can happen is you can get more of a watercolor look, which is a beautiful look in itself, but not the look that I'm going for this particular card, so I needed to start. So I'm gonna go ahead and clean off my stamp now that I'm all finished my stamping, and I'm gonna make sure that it's dry because I don't wanna get any ink on my embossing ink. I just brought a brand new pad and I don't wanna get it all dirty. So I'm gonna stamp it directly on top using Versamark ink or embossing ink so that I can add embossing powder over top. So what I'm doing this time is I'm using some Wonderlust embossing powder. I'll link to embossing powder that is similar to this below because I believe this is retired, but what this is it's clear embossing powder with glitter. And so it's a good way to add glitter that isn't too messy, and it's not going to distract from all the beautiful stamping that you just did, but it's going to enhance it by adding a beautiful shimmery look. You can see how much these cards shimmer, how beautiful they turned out. You can still see all the different colors of stamping in it. It doesn't distract, but enhances the stamped image. A great way to add embossing with ink blending. For our next technique, we're going to be combining some of the things that we've learned in previous videos to create a really beautiful card. So once again, I'm going in and I'm inking up, but this time I'm inking on a rubber stamp versus a clear stamp. You can see that I can apply the ink pad directly, but I am going in and dabbing the edges just to soften them up so I don't get harsh lines. I'm going to go ahead and stamp this then on the piece of cardstock that I'm using for my card panel, and I'm going to be not inking the entire background but just the side. And this way I create a background with multiple colors that is very interesting. I'm going to continue to repeat this method over and over with the colors that I like until I get a look that I am personally happy with. You can see that this stamp is very detailed, it is very intricate, and it really does make a true difference when you are creating this as to whether you add embossing powder at the end or not. And I will show you in a little bit what the difference looks like versus stamping it just normally and leaving it as is, which is beautiful, versus adding some clear embossing powder to your image. So I've kept my stamp in the exact same position, and I'm going over top of the stamp now with the clear ink, the embossing ink, and I'm going to emboss over it using some clear embossing powder. Off screen, I added my embossing powder, and you can see that I'm melting it here with my heat tool. This is making it look even more detailed, more shiny, more bold, and more crisp in my opinion. I never really think of doing this, but after doing it on this particular card, I think I'm going to be doing this technique a lot more often. You can see here the difference. On the left is heat embossed with clear powder, and on the right, it's just simply stamped. They're both beautiful, but there's definitely a difference in the way that those look. To finish off this particular card, I decided to go in, similar to a mandala, and evenly space jewels and pearls all over the design. So I'm adding them in different places of the pattern. So inside of the feathers where it makes that typical peacock sort of look, I don't know what that's called, where it comes together at the end, I'm covering them with a pearl. I can do this all around the edges, just keeping in mind I do need room for a sentiment. So it might be a good idea to stamp your sentiment or die cut a sentiment first before adding all of these jewels, but sometimes in hindsight, you know better at the end of the day. But, you know, I was able to work around it. It just required me to pick and choose a sentiment that was small enough to fit in the area that I'd allocated. So I'm adding a sentiment that I have in my collection that are all peacock themed so that the sentiments really coordinate with all the products. And this one says, "You're not as weird as you think. Peacocks are weirder." I think this is a super fun sentiment that I'm totally sending to my sister. And for that other background that I showed you that I stamped the whole background, but I didn't heat emboss on top of it, I just simply finished it off with a "so proud of you" sentiment and added a couple of jewels to the bottom here just to make things a little prettier and more elegant. Now, if you enjoyed seeing all of these techniques, then come join me over here in this video, because here I'm going to show you 5 techniques that I have forgotten about over the years that are quick, simple, and easy using the same products that I showed in this video. So let's head on over there together and watch the video. Leave me a comment there to let me know that you came over from this video so I know how many are following me over. I'll see you later. Bye-bye.